Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo. Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo.
All right, we're back for part 2 of chapter 5 of After Buddhism. This chapter is called Letting Go of Truth. And we had a quick conversation in the break and just about, feeling good about this content in this episode and talking about the value of really like personalizing the content, like in particular, like Mitchell and I sharing our own experiences and our own challenges. And I think in a lot of ways, that's some of the best work or the most important work I've ever done is these kinds of things where we're doing a book study or we're, like one-on-one coaching is one of my favorite things to do because it's like responding to an individual and being able to share like with a real life situation, how the Dharma relates. And I realized like from the beginning, that's what's resonated for me. Like from the very beginning, what has resonated for me is these types of conversations where I realized like this is what the whole book's about is like bringing the Dharma into a modern secular age. And so I guess that's in a way that like makes me feel fulfilled in a way to kind of recognize. So long story short, yeah, personalizing the content is my favorite thing to do. And I wouldn't want to do it with anybody more than Mitchell. All right. So jumping into part 3, I'll read the first paragraph here at least. It says, as the concept of truth metamorphosed from a virtue into a synonym for reality, it exerted a deep and lasting influence on how Buddhists came to understand the nature and purpose of their practice. This is particularly evident in the way the 4 tasks has come down to us. As we have seen, the discourse presents the fourfold task that lies at the heart of the Buddha's vision. By accomplishing it, he claimed to have attained peerless awakening. As the text of the discourse evolved over time, these 4 tasks became progressively overlaid with and obscured by the doctrine of the 4 Noble Truths. Fortunately, a close reading of the text enables us to see how this shift from tasks to truths took place. And he says, these are the lines from the 4 tasks that spell out the nature of each task in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. And I'll read this as a way to frame the discussion of this part. Bhikkhu Bodhi translates this as, this noble truth of suffering is to be fully understood. This noble truth of the origin of suffering is to be abandoned. This noble truth of the cessation of suffering is to be realized. And this noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering is to be developed. And Batchelor says, I have no issue with the translation. This is indeed what the Pali text says. The problem is that none of these 4 statements can possibly mean what they say. Dun, dun, dun. I love that way of framing the chapter up. I got this feeling from the beginning because of what he goes here to explain in the context of F.L. Woodward, who did a translation of the 4 tasks in the 1930, and he wanted to change the wording of the second noble truth. And the reason he said that is he said we must omit Arya Sakam, which is the word noble truth. And he was saying we need to omit that from the second noble truth. And the reason he says is because otherwise the text would mean the noble truth about the arising of ill is to be put away. But the fact is that craving has to be put away. The frame has obscured the picture here, he says. So when we say for that second noble truth, if we say the noble truth of the origin of suffering is to be abandoned, we're talking about abandoning the truth, when what we need to abandon is the craving or the reactivity, So like, that's like the first hint in this mystery.
Yeah. I don't really have anything to add yet, although I did find it interesting to recognize that I'd never really thought about that before.
Yeah.
You know, like it was never a red flag to me for whatever reason.
Do you
I don't
think
know.
that because I think part of the reason why I didn't linger on it much, because I know I'd thought about it before, but I got past it real quick. But I think part of the reason I got past it was because of all the exposition or stuff that other people said about it. It was through the process of learning about it
Yeah.
and really kind of honestly like
Right.
learning the actual situation rather than the truth. You know, like coming into contact with the practice rather than some sort of frozen idea of concept of truth.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess that probably is exactly it. Which does speak to again, like this recurring need to make all of this practical and have some regular means of practice as the main mode of understanding it all. I mean, I do have that in my note on this section is just like the whole thing of like understanding truths can sort of lead us to prioritize or pursue is what I have uh, abstract knowledge rather than real experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's that third one, actually the fourth one. The noble truth of the path is to be developed. And he kind of points out, well, how do you develop a truth? You know, is it going to become more true?
Right.
In this case, he says the text means the way, the Eightfold Path is to be developed, but it says that the noble truth is to be developed. So, so similarly, it's not the noble truth of suffering that we need to comprehend, but suffering itself, you know. And if we get hung up trying to understand the noble truth, his point is we may never connect with the very simple, direct, personal experiences of dukkha that are available to us every day as our path, you know, those are in a way like those are our treasures, all those little instances of annoyance and discomfort and boredom, like that's our raw materials, you know. And if we're hung up trying to understand the noble truth, you know, like that's probably taking us away from waiting in line and using that as practice, or having somebody say something in a way that you think is a little inappropriate or disrespectful, and, you know, using that as a path of wisdom and compassion as opposed to justifying the effluences of desire and aggression and ignorance, you know. But he said such and such, you know. It's like, well, you could also just sit with your discomfort in that moment and turn it into something, you know, good.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one simple way of kind of putting all this too might be to just remind ourselves that, like, from what we can tell, right, like the Dharma is not really so much like an exalted religious philosophy at all. It's just, you know, existential, practical instructions or guides.
Yeah. And that's maybe that's another part of why, like, we're afraid of it, is like, it's maybe a little bit scary to recognize that, like, these noble truths are pretty damn mundane.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
like,
yeah.
these exalted truths of the enlightened beings, you know, that we're learning are all of the little junk in our life. You know, like that's what they are, you know. And that's probably part of the reason why in the Vajrayana path we're visualizing as like royalty in a way, you know, and like we need to kind of see all of this in a shifted perspective of preciousness and you know, I don't know, like just beauty and resource, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, great point to bring in there. I feel like to remind ourselves that the point of that stuff is not to give ourselves a fancy royal means of distraction, but rather to bring that, like, to see our everyday seemingly mundane, ordinary experiences as the sacred royal thing. I mean, it's
Yeah.
easy to potentially not take that point from those teachings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that relates to the next quote I had here was, by shifting the emphasis from task to truth, the Buddhist tradition begins to tacitly privilege abstract knowledge over felt experience. As long as Buddhist teachers persist in employing the language of noble truth, they unthinkingly endorse the preeminence of doctrine, of belief over practical application. Man, that if there's one thesis for why I think this book matters, that's probably it. Is like I don't think anyone's trying to teach, ineffectively or to teach methods that are going to send people down pitfalls, or rabbit holes, that they're dead end paths, in a way. But I think that's happening, when we don't think about the effects of what we're teaching and bringing it into modern context, our current context. And there's another philologist that he mentions in here, K.R. Norman, who says, in fact, that Woodward did not go far enough. And in fact, that he should have removed noble truth, Arya Sakam, altogether. Shouldn't have been there at all. And he says, Batchelor says, this is tantamount to saying that what is widely regarded as the fundamental doctrine of Buddhism was grafted onto pre-existing teachings. What caught Woodward's eyes were still visible stitch marks left by those anonymous hands that inexpertly interpreted the phrase noble truth. And this brings to mind, if anyone's listened to that amazing podcast, S-Town, which I would highly recommend. Like, they talk, John B. McLemore, they talk about, he's a watchmaker, and they talk about witness marks. I think it's how the whole podcast starts, is talking about like looking for these witness marks in a watch. And witness marks are like tiny scratches or maybe like a hole where a screw used to be, or just some indicator of what work has potentially been done before or what the mechanism was before. So searching for these witness marks. And I think like I see when he talks about these still visible stitch marks left by the anonymous hands, like that reminds me of that idea of like witness marks. And it's really neat that we can look at this fundamental Buddhist teaching and for another couple sections here, explore the ways that it potentially changed since its original inception, why those changes were made, and how it may not be appropriate changes for today. Those things that were added for a reason in the past, that reason may not exist anymore. And actually, that reminds me too of a great analogy I heard once about the Buddha. I think I probably told this in a previous episode, but there was a talk that the Karmapa gave in Kingston in like 2015, where he used the example of like this analogy. He said, like, let's say that the Buddha taught in a room, and there was a door to his left, and that was the only door out of the room. And so the Buddha finishes teaching, and he says, we will now leave through the door to the left, and so everyone leaves through the door in the left. And then time passes, hundreds of years, the Gautama has passed away at this point. People are still leaving through the door on the left, and then they build an addition or something onto the temple, and now there's a door on the right that also leaves the shrine room. But because the Buddha said to leave through the door through the left, everyone continues to go through the door on the left because that's what the Buddha said. But the idea is like there's no real reason for that. Like the Buddha said to go through the door on the left because it was the only door, and like now there's another door. And so we need to kind of be aware that like there's always context for teachings, and it's more important that we understand the underlying situation than hew to a specific instruction or truth claim,
Yeah, wow, that's great. I was at that talk, but that didn't stick out to me as it does now.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. That helped me a lot.
And I mean, just to like, I guess, bring it back around. I don't know if you have anything else about this section, but I feel like that image of the frame obscuring the picture is like one of the main takeaways for me from here. It comes again at the very end there. That's a good thing to contemplate.
Yeah. I like that too. So yeah, then we're on to part 4, which I think focuses a lot on this idea of samudaya. And the first paragraph of this section says, the shift from tasks to truths, from know-how to knowledge, entailed distorting some of the earliest texts. If we continue probing the Buddhist doctrine of the Four Noble Truths, further anomalies become apparent. Take the term samudaya. Woodward and I translated as arising. I.B. Horner translated as uprising. Yet the standard translation used by Walpola Rahula, Maurice Walsh, Bhikkhu Bodhi, and others is origin. At first glance, origin seems the right choice. After all, Buddhist orthodoxy, based on the Four Noble Truths, insists that tanha, craving or reactivity, is the origin of suffering. Dukkha samudaya, the origin of suffering. This is understood to mean that craving is the root cause of suffering, the condition without which suffering would not occur. Since suffering is defined as birth, aging, sickness, and death, he quotes the Buddha here, in short, these 5 bundles of clinging, end quote, then craving becomes the causal origin of everything that we experience as human beings. From here, it logically follows that in order to bring suffering, and by implication, life, to an end, one must bring the craving that causes it to an end. Only in this way is it possible to end the cycle of endless death and rebirth, all of which will be extinguished in a final nirvana. This, in a nutshell, is the metaphysical foundation of Buddhism. And I think what stood out to me here just in the very beginning of this chapter is this idea, like, if we really do think of reactivity as the origin of suffering, then I think he's got a really interesting point here that, like, if we're going to bring that to an end, we're bringing life to an end. Like, I never really thought about that before, but like birth, aging, sickness, and death, like, that's going to be, I mean, the Buddha experienced those things after his awakening. So there is something a little funny about that idea of like bringing birth, aging, and sickness and death, that like that could be equated with some sort of death, you know, like some sort of ending of life. And I never thought about it that way before.
Yeah, I know. I never really did either in those kind of explicit terms, although I think we know that there is frequently some kind of like implication, if not outright teaching, that the actual results of our practice will be somewhere else later, not in this life, you know. Like we might experience some temporary relative benefits, but like actual liberation is not for this lifetime. That is definitely there. That idea is definitely there. I don't, you know, who knows? But
I'm so glad we're going through this, because this comes up. The book turns to this and the idea of future lifetimes pretty soon. So I don't know that I have a good response for that now, but it's going to turn to this idea of because I think one of his theses is that you can be Buddhist without believing in past and future lifetimes. And then in fact, the idea of past and future lifetimes is very likely one of those things that came from the Brahmanical tradition. So I know exactly what you mean, and I get it, and I've heard that too, and I think it's definitely potentially a teaching method that's very helpful. But I'll be interested to hear what he says about that, because I know it turns to this karma and rebirth kind of question too.
Yeah, well, and I mean, on a broader level too. I mean, it's like not that different than the idea of heaven in Christianity. You know, I feel like I'm talking about some of what we've kind of heard.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. like practically it ends up being basically the same thing as that, like salvation promised at a later date in some ideal realm that's not like this dirty little place.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? Again, who knows? I'm just saying, like,
Yeah. I have a friend who always says, like, I'll either find out or I won't.
right. Yeah.
But yeah, so this word samudaya, he goes on to say that the only place in the canon where samudaya is used in a causal sense is in the expression craving is the origin of suffering. Otherwise, samudaya always means fruit or result. So a quote I wrote here is, reactivity is what arises when a living, feeling organism comes into contact with its environment. So we could say that reactivity is the fruit or result of coming into contact with our environment. And he says this is supported in the 12 links of conditioned arising, which if anyone's ever seen The Wheel of Life, it's a very cool Buddhist tanka, amazing teaching tool, like really awesome. Like it's one of my favorite paintings, or iconography in the Tibetan tradition. But it explains like the 12 links of conditioned arising, what leads to conditioned arising. And I'll read the quote here. It says, the point of this doctrine is to provide a true account of reality. I'm sorry, the point of this doctrine is not to provide a true account of reality, but to describe an effective framework for the performance of a task. By noticing how one instinctively reacts to feelings prompted by contact, one is in a better position to let go of such reactivity by seeing it arise and cease, instead of getting caught up in it. To successfully perform this task, it is irrelevant whether or not craving is the origin of suffering. Letting go of the reactive cascades of thoughts and emotions that arise in one's mind because they are the principal obstacle to entering the stream of the path. Reactivity is problematic not because it causes suffering, which of course it often does, but because it prevents genuine human flourishing. So we could read these four noble truths, that second one, as saying that reactivity is the result of suffering. Like, of course it is. Like when we come into contact with our world, there's going to be reactivity. We still need to let go of it. Doesn't matter whether it's the cause of the suffering or the result of the suffering. In any case, it needs to be let go of. Mm-hmm. And I think thinking, again, like pedagogically, there's a little potential of problems when we think of it, of suffering as craving as the origin of suffering. Then some conflicts come up. Then this idea of like needing to end life for nirvana, comes up. But there's really no problem in thinking of it could be either. So I love the way he says it's like irrelevant. It reminds me of those 8 questions that he gives in the very first chapter about like, does the Buddha exist after death or not? Does the world exist? I mean, there's the 8 questions, who created the world kind of questions, that are really irrelevant to the practice of Dharma. And I think I love like this section because it kind of points out something that really maybe the biggest point for me so far is this idea that like reactivity could well be the result of suffering, but that does not change the task that needs to happen.
I also love the whole point about like reactivity kind of just being like the natural response of an organism to its environment, like to me, that's really helpful in terms of allowing us to come to terms with it and let it go easily. And the reason that I feel like it makes it easier to relate to is because it sort of frames it as some, like a sort of a natural process rather than like a sin. That's the key point to me, like it's not really something, we're not bad for having reactivity. It's just like a natural process that we could maybe work with a little more skillfully. that's Buddhism, or I mean, Dharma, whatever. Like that's a difference, I guess, in the thinking or the logic involved with this wisdom tradition, as opposed to maybe our native one, for example. And as people who are coming to these teachings from a different cultural background, I think it's important sometimes for us to really consciously recognize how the thinking is different here, because like we could easily maybe a little bit unconsciously fall into kind of equating, let's just use this example, like reactivity with sin. You know what I'm saying? It's not really the point here. We don't need to really even feel bad about it. It's just be kind of maybe more a matter of being grateful for the situation being pointed out,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is, I think, like that's again and again, that's a place in our practice where we could really get things wrong, because seeing reactivity is really the first thing that's necessary in order to let it go. And if we're taking the reactivity as a lost battle, like every time the reactivity comes up, it's like we're starting with the idea that this is something's gone wrong. To get back to what we talked about in the last episode, like that's maybe the resistance, that light resistance, that extra resistance we add to life, that friction, that actually causes it's always it's a reaction to some reactivity, Yeah,
definitely. Along these same lines, I love what he says on page 125 about how this whole process is maybe more accurately said to be a matter of coming to terms with suffering rather than ending it,
This is is it this one? What began as a fourfold task for coming to terms with dukkha mutated into a four-part metaphysics for explaining and overcoming dukkha. A practice for enabling life to flourish turned into a theory for bringing life to an end. Like a lot of times people will bring up, like when we talk about emptiness, they'll bring up like this fear, like a fear sense of emptiness. And I think like this could be the logical conclusion of what we mistake as a fear of emptiness. It could be this maybe not entirely thought out, but known on some subconscious level idea that bringing reactivity to an end brings life to an end, that brings experience to an end. And that I think could manifest as a sense of fear of emptiness, or fear of, the actual situation of interdependence and impermanence. Because I think there may be a sense, because of learning in this format of the Four Noble Truths that claims reactivity to be the cause of suffering, that if we bring that to an end, we bring us to an end, and we bring everyone we know to an end, and it's just over, and I think that maybe this could be part of how people get there.
Yeah, I could definitely see that.
And I think it's also resulted in potentially sometimes pained or at least tricky descriptions of the differences between pain and suffering. Like I think, they've been helpful to me at times, but I know like Tralek Rinpoche in his book, Integral Buddhism, talks about that, and talks about how there's the way he kind of reconciles this is by saying like pain, is something we'll always have to deal with, but suffering is what we create. And granted, this is a lot of semantics, but I think when we say that reactivity is the cause of suffering, like we have to also somehow mold that or qualify it to make it make sense, but again, maybe we don't need that. Maybe that is just irrelevant. Maybe it doesn't matter whether it's the cause or the result. In any case, we still need to let go of it, and it still works. So going on, he says, we have 4 domains in the 4 tasks. So he calls these like the domains of human existence. We have the domain of dukkha, suffering, which is the totality of our existential condition in the physical world, in our body and mind, etc. The second domain is the arising, reactivity or craving. And this includes desire, aggression, and delusion. He says, whatever reactivity is triggered by our contact with the world. The third domain is the ceasing, which is the end of that reactivity. It's equivalent to what was described in earlier chapters as the deathless or nirvana. And then we have the domain of the path, the eightfold path, which is to be applied to all aspects of life. And then we connect that to the practices for each domain. So we comprehend suffering. We let go of the arising. We behold the ceasing. We cultivate the path. And we can use this task, he says, as a sequence. So we can kind of go through them one by one, or it could just be a collection of tasks that intersects and overlap. So like, for instance, in a given moment, one of those tasks may be the appropriate thing to do. Like in a given moment, when we talk about this idea of the appropriate statement could be one of those four in a given situation. And I think I pointed out before, but I'll reiterate that, like, I like the idea that, like, really three of these are not intellectually active endeavors. Comprehend maybe in a way is, but I think a lot of comprehending is really just taking in information, and in a way, like when we said wisdom earlier, I think it's related to that wisdom quality of knowing things as they are, and then letting go of reactivity, beholding suffering, and then the only one that's really, like, I think explicitly active is the path. Doing some one of the eightfold path kind of things. And I just bring that up again because I think in general, we're way too hung up on actively trying to change our situation. And I think a lot of the Dharma is designed to help us turn more towards these more acceptance and awareness oriented, wisdom and compassion oriented practices that often don't involve us trying to manipulate any external circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Totally agree with that. I feel like that stance or that view or that way of seeing whatever is kind of its own way of engaging. You know what I mean? Like, it's not active, but I feel like it sometimes it's not as explicitly active. It's maybe more passive, but that's still a way of acting. It kind of gets into the way in which it's hard to actually separate that, and that might be a little bit semantic, but I guess the point is that no matter what, you can't really get out of engaging with reality, so to speak. Like, even if you take this maybe a little bit more of a passive wisdom and compassion stance where you're not acting or going out and manipulating the world, but you're choosing to operate more from the way you see it, let's say, that's still a mode of action.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's just a little more subtle. The reason that's coming up for me is that, like, I had somebody come to the meditation group on Sunday, and we had like a really good discussion sort of based on that. Like, the question or the query was, what would you say to somebody who felt like meditation was a little bit like a waste of time? Like, shouldn't I be doing something more with that window of time or something? And that's kind of the discussion we got into, is that, like, it's not really doing nothing. It's still, for one, it's like still a gesture of relating to things, and that mode of action of reframing the way we see things will then go on to inform everything we do. So there's no way you could really argue that it's doing nothing or a waste of time, because we're not really ever able to disengage. It's just not really, it's a false notion that we even have the ability to do that, I think.
Yeah. And I think it also gets at like when we do a thing, is it, and I'll use more from that Elizabeth Stanley book that I've been reading. She brings up the concept of domain general learning versus domain specific learning. And I think meditation is clearly a domain general learning practice. You know, like when we sit down and we work with just basic placing of the attention, we are learning how to use a skill that we can apply in any situation and will bring benefits to like every corner of our life. So it's not like we're just doing a specific, and maybe that's kind of the thing, is maybe that's another imbalance we all have, is we're really hung up on like taking care of a specific problem, you know, and it may be harder for us to catch when a practice actually helps all of the situations, you know? And I think that's kind of one of the reasons for meditation in particular, like an active practice of meditation, is to, work on a skill that we can apply everywhere and that we need everywhere, because any other decisions we're going to make, the more aware we are of what the situation actually is, and the better able we are to meet that situation with courage or compassion, however we want to look at it, the much better equipped we are for ourselves and everybody else. So, and luckily it doesn't even take that much to get those kind of benefits in our lives. So it is very much a domain general learning situation. So, and if it's domain general, that means that we can associate it with any specific thing we want. We could think about how a practice of meditation, like that's interesting, because I've gotten that question before too. I think in the future, what I may ask people in response is, what thing in particular would you do that would be more beneficial than the meditation? And then maybe talk about how meditation actually would support that, you know? I've never taken that approach, but I think thinking about it today, that's how I may hit it in the future.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So moving on, we talk about, now he kind of shifts to like how suffering got put into here. So he says, we had this, when we look at it as the domains and the tasks: comprehend suffering, let go of the arising, behold the ceasing, cultivate the path. We can see this as a sequence. We can see it as options. But eventually, though, the teaching was turned into a theory of suffering and how to overcome it. So then the situation became suffering, the arising of suffering, the ceasing of suffering, and the path that leads to the ceasing of suffering. So initially, it was just one of the four, but now the whole thing becomes about suffering. And this meant that we had to start doing all this paraphrasing about the other truths in order for them to make sense. You know, the third truth is just the end of suffering. But we've already kind of learned that, like, in order for birth, aging, sickness, and death, these five clusters, I think, or however the Buddha said it, then that's the ending of our total experience. So many people have experienced the end of suffering, and their experience didn't end, including the Buddha. The Buddha still had pains and aches and sickness. He still got older. He still experienced suffering. So we know that it can't be the case that suffering ends with that third noble truth, but that the result of adding suffering to each of those was that we get this logical confusion. You know, we get this general confusion of the ending of suffering can't mean what it says. Letting go of reactivity and beholding its ceasing, that's hard, but it's achievable. The end of birth, aging, sickness, and death is not going to happen as long as we have a body. So it makes a lot more sense to try to let go of reactivity and behold its ceasing, you know. And my only other thought is that the odd outcome of the ceasing of suffering is just another one of those witness marks, you know, one of those watchmaker kind of clues of the fact that people have tinkered with this original teaching and grafted suffering onto each task, and then finally added noble truth. And we ended up with the noble truth of suffering, and the noble truth of the arising of suffering, and the noble truth of the ceasing of suffering. And you know what? Like, I'll just come out and say it here too. Suffering is a bummer. Like, if we just want to even talk about marketing, like, do we really want to make this all about suffering? Like I've had multiple people tell me like this was an impediment for them even getting involved in the Dharma because all we're talking about is suffering.
Right.
We don't have to. We really don't have to, and I think a lot of more modern teachers, and particularly Western teachers, try not to because they recognize that suffering is a bummer. And yes, we need to comprehend it. I'm not saying like that first domain is not important. But again, let's not be unthinking about this. Let's think about the fact that at some point somebody added suffering onto all of this and made it all about suffering. And that gives us logical inconsistencies. It's not good marketing. It's just, I'm glad we can see that there may be, actually the way he says it here, he uses the phrase, now the four tasks are syntactically absurd appendages to the four truths.
Yeah.
And it's true.
Yeah.
Right on. And then we jump to part 5, which is where we move to the ultimate and relative truth. I'll read the first paragraph here too. In taking a metaphysical turn toward truth, Buddhists shifted away from an emphasis on know-how to an emphasis on knowledge. They became increasingly concerned with attaining a state of mind that could allow them to gain infallible knowledge of truth or reality. And then to talk about this, he uses the idea of the claims of omniscience for the Buddha and how that developed. And the Buddha denied being omniscient. But in the same discourse, he admits to recollection of past lives, the divine eye that sees beings pass away and be reborn again according to their acts, and 3, direct knowledge of the destruction of the effluences, desire, aggression, and bewilderment. So he definitely seemed to know more about how things are than your average bear, but he did not talk about valid cognition, logical inference, and yogic perception, which have become regular topics in Buddhism years later. So this idea of omniscience, and I've kind of wondered in some of the stories we hear about the Buddha, like a lot of times when we hear stories about the life of the Buddha, like if he was omniscient, like it seems like he would understand a lot more than he maybe sounds like he does in these situations. And then we can also double back and kind of say like, well, but he did all of this as a demonstration, or he was, manipulating the situation so he could teach a certain way. And I'm not saying that's impossible, or I don't believe that, but like, could also be that he wasn't omniscient, like he said,
Yeah. I know I'm not going to be able to recall it well enough to like give it exactly, but I know I remember somewhere in Trungpa's teachings, he talks about this, the whole idea of omniscience, and his way of explaining it is something like to point out that by omniscient, in this case, we don't necessarily mean literally omniscient, like completely all-knowing about every single possible known detail of the universe, but it means omniscient, like direct insight into the fundamental way that reality unfolds, which, makes a lot more sense. Like, he's not necessarily going to know like what pair of shoes so-and-so was wearing like 1,000,000 years ago, but it's like, understanding of the fundamental modes of reality or something. There may be problems with that too, but it makes a lot more sense than some idea of like, like the way that God would be omniscient or something.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and looking back at this list of what the Buddha did admit to, I could see this as a past, like knowing the 3 times, past, future, and present moment. So like recollection of his past lives, or recollection of past lives, so where he was before, which like we said in an earlier chapter, if you look at your situation now, you can usually see what in the rearview mirror brought you here. And similarly with the future, he has the divine eye that sees beings pass away and be reborn again according to their acts. So again, in the present moment, he can see how things will end up for people or himself. And then there's also the direct knowledge of the destruction of the effluences, which sounds to me like the present moment, the fruit of the four tasks, seeing what happens when you let go of desire, aggression, and bewilderment. And that is a little different than I think maybe what we think of. Like, I think I hear omniscience, I think of like what you said about like wearing the shoes and the, on what day, or what was the special at Joe's Cafe on March 3rd, right. Nobody knows. So, but that makes a lot more sense. And I can get on board with that a lot easier, because I think if you could understand that fundamental process, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then we go into the ultimate and relative truth, which we talked about before, and we talk about it a lot, especially in Vajrayana Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, and how that may have evolved from the Buddha's twofold ground of conditioned arising and nirvana. But he mentions that there is nowhere in the discourses where we see conditioned arising referred to as a conventional truth. And the quote here is simply stated, the two truths doctrine is a way of distinguishing between the conventional truths of everyday life that we need in order to function as social and moral agents, and the ultimate truth. And ultimate truth is basically everything. Everything reduces down to ultimate truth. And other than ultimate truth, everything else is at best only conventionally true. And I'll point out that like this ultimate and relative truth thing was huge for me in my learning process. Like, so I know, again, like there is value to pedagogy that may also have dubious origins, or may not be timely anymore, or may not be correct for other contexts. But I just want to say straight up, like ultimate and relative truth was a big help for me learning about that. And especially I think when it comes to thinking about like trauma-informed side of meditation, like I very much think about ultimate and relative truth as being related to like hyper-focused or spaced out, or we could even say like the obstacles to meditation, of being agitated or dull, like I think there is a way of thinking of ultimate and relative truth as being related with those ideas, because if we're too hyper-focused, it's usually some sort of relative truth that we're hyper-focused on. And if we're too spaced out or dull, we may be kind of leaning too hard on the ultimate truth aspect of a situation. But again, like he points out that nowhere in the sutras, not even once, does the Buddha use the words sammutisaka or paramatthisaka, which are conventional or ultimate truth. Buddha didn't say those in the sutras.
Mm-hmm. He mentions the may have originated in the Buddha's vision of a twofold ground, conditioned arising and nirvana. And it's easier to understand even like the notion of the two truths that developed. It's still sort of easier to understand that according to maybe what its original meaning would have been than with the Four Noble Truths and the Fourfold Task. Like this is, I guess I'm just saying, like this seems to me less convoluted, because to me the way that the two truths kind of always came across was like the twofold ground, basically.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have said it like that, but like I feel like that one holds up a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what he's kind of saying is that when we start to call these things truths, he says we inevitably end up with an ontological mindset, thinking about what really is and what's merely useful or consensus. And he has a quote from the chapter of Eights where he says, "The priest without borders doesn't seize on what he's known or beheld, not passionate, not dispassionate. He doesn't posit anything as supreme. One who dwells in supreme views and presents them as final will declare all other views inferior. He has not overcome disputes. So I think like the question is like, how did ultimate truth become this like central pillar of the teachings, and the relative truth became like inferior? And he says here in the book, he says Mahayana Buddhists came to regard everything taught in the Pali Canon as inferior, lesser. Hence the term Hinayana Buddhism that I think we've talked about before, which is a problematic term. There are teachers who say it's not a problematic term, but there are people who feel it's a problematic term. So it's a problematic term. And I think this is part of the reason, whether it's problematic because it's potentially insulting to people who practice a different kind of Buddhism, or just because it somehow makes it seem like methods that apply directly to this life are lesser, and not as important. When in fact, it's a twofold. If we think of it as a twofold ground, it's like, I don't think it's different when we talk about ultimate truth and relative truth, but it makes it sound different. So again, we're talking about the effect of the language and the pedagogy. I do think they mean the same thing, and they can mean the same thing, but it's more likely when we call them ultimate and relative truth, and the way we treat them as ultimate being like this space of accomplished beings. They get to know that, and we hang out, like you said earlier, kind of in this dirty, mundane, realm, worldly realm. That's problematic. So, I think he says that when this doctrine took hold, that began the development of the Buddhism we have today.
Yeah, I love that phrase in the quote there, the priest without borders.
Yeah.
That phrase somehow it's like one of those, I don't know exactly what it means, but it definitely strikes some sort of intuitive chord. It's like it communicates something, something sort of that's right on.
Yeah. It resonates. Yeah,
exactly.
I want to read this paragraph. He says, we do not know exactly when, how, or why the Buddhists made the fateful choice of embracing the doctrine of the two truths, but in doing so, they adopted more than a simple theory. The two truths became the spectacles through which Buddhism came to see itself, its teachings, and its institutions. Once their eyes had adjusted to seeing things in this way, Buddhists forgot that they were wearing glasses. The world that appeared through these lenses became so familiar and self-evident that they took it for granted. It was simply the way things were and always had been. And then he goes on to talk a little bit too about how the two truths mirror Brahmanical concepts of Brahma, God, and Maya, the world of multiplicity, suffering, and illusion. And that reminded me to go and listen to George Harrison's Beware of Darkness from the All Things Must Pass album, which is a fantastic album. And I would highly recommend that. But that Beware of Darkness song is great. He's got like the Beware of Maya exhortation in there. But to read on a little bit, he said the two truths also provided Buddhism with a template for ecclesiastical power. So ultimate truth became known only by the privileged few, and only the privileged few had the philosophical and epistemological means to even talk about it. So now it's not even just something that they alone can have had or can have, but they alone are the only ones with the education and the language and stuff to even begin to talk about it properly. And so Batchelor says this resulted in a professional and often deeply conservative clergy who resist any attempt by the disempowered, particularly women, to challenge their authority. Another effect of the two truths has been to reinforce and legitimate dualistic thinking in general, such as what we've been talking about, sacred versus profane, eternal versus transitory, unconditioned versus conditioned, reality versus appearance. And one more quote I want to read here is...
that's interesting.
Yeah. Wherever religious or quasi-religious dogma takes root, it seems people start thinking in terms of higher, uncorrupted reality, in contrast to which they inhabit a lower, corrupted realm. Whether this duality is phrased in terms of creator and creation or nirvana and samsara makes little difference. Once under the sway of such charged oppositional thinking, a person's life becomes neatly divided into a spiritual zone and a worldly zone. The former becomes associated with all that is good, eternal, and true, while the latter tends to be regarded as unworthy, embarrassing, and ephemeral. In the history of Buddhism, this dualism led to a recurrent emphasis on the innate purity of mind as opposed to the defiled, unclean nature of the body. And I don't have much more to say about this, but I want to point out that he does kind of put forward the Heart Sutra, which is with its famous lines like form is emptiness, emptiness is form is not separate from emptiness. He claims this is perhaps a means to try to reconcile the unintended consequence of ultimate truth seeming both separate from relative truth and inseparable from it. But ultimately, emptiness is meaningless apart from form. And so long story short, he says Batchelor says that the adoption of the two truths created a slew of problems that need not have arisen. And he even invokes Humpty Dumpty here.
I just was reminded of that when I looked down. It just one kind of cool like saving grace that still exists in the Buddhist teachings is I do appreciate that we still have the sentiment in the Vajrayana lore, of like the Mahasiddhas and like crazy wrathful wisdom ladies. Like there is a bunch of like, from maybe a more conservative point of view, a lot of like freaky, non-conventional religious stuff that like, even if it just exists, like, I just feel like it's great that it's there and it hasn't all been lost.
Yeah.
Like it's not really the kind of thing that most teachers are going to emphasize or even attempt to make super practical for us. But like the fact that it's still there is a saving grace, I think.
Yeah. I agree. Well, I'll just close this chapter with the last paragraph here, which says, is it still possible to recover a pre-orthodox dharma, one that existed prior to the doctrine of the two truths, and built upon that foundation an adequate ethical, contemplative, and philosophical practice that would optimize human flourishing in a secular age? And then on to part 6, we are given a quote here from an indisputably early source that seems to contradict everything that has just been said. And it says, there is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, uncompounded. If there were not this unborn, unmade, unbecome, and uncompounded, then there would be no deliverance here visible from what is born, become, made, compounded. But since there is an unborn, unbecome, unmade, uncompounded, therefore a deliverance is visible from what is born, become, made, and compounded. And this, he notes, is the text that's often cited as the proof of ultimate truth. And he quotes another scholar, Walsh, who cites this as Buddhism's answer to Atman, the idea of Atman, like a persistent self, like a real, actual self. And he claims that this idea of ultimate truth is a fundamental basis of true religion, Walsh does, and takes it upon himself to capitalize unborn in this translation in contrast to born, lowercase. Yeah. So what we have a quote here where the Buddha declared when he discovered awakening, what he discovered was conditioned arising, which sounds different than the unborn, unmade, uncompounded. And in fact, there's a quote here where he says, I will teach you, this is Gautama speaking. He says, listen, bhikkhus, I will teach you the all. And what is the all? The eye and forms, the ear and sounds, the nose and smells, the tongue and tastes, the body and sensations, the mind and its contents. That is called the all. If anyone should say, having rejected this all, I will make known another all, that would be a mere empty boast on his part. If he were questioned, he would not be able to reply, and further would end up frustrated. Why? Because that all would not be within his domain. So really the question, I guess, is how does this unborn exist within this all? Because from what he just said, there is no all separate from the eye and the vision or the objects of our sight or our ears and what we hear. That is the all. So this unborn, if it exists, has to somehow be one with those things, or at least not or exist within them, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my way of understanding this was sort of just that, like, all these, the unborn, unbecome, unmade, uncompounded, basically like all of that, all of those are just sort of synonyms for emptiness. Basically, like all of those terms are a way of evoking the nirvana aspect of the twofold ground, essentially. But yeah, I mean, I can definitely see the problem though with emphasizing that side of the twofold ground, with this sort of capital letter reverence of a religious philosophy. Sort of prioritizes that over the side of experience and conditioned arising when they're actually inseparable.
Yeah, and contextually, another thing I would point out about our modern culture is like the main device of marketing over the last, 100 years, maybe more, has been trying to make people feel like they don't have the best thing. This dynamic of you're lacking something and you need something else. And so I think, again, in terms of looking at secular context, bringing the Dharma into this modern age, we need to recognize that we're very much trained to think that we're lacking in our current situation. And do we want to use that same dynamic in order to help people connect with the all of what they see and what they hear and what they feel, like in this moment now, in completeness, I think that's another thing we need to recognize, that when we go into this ontological framework of unborn and born, and capitalizing, the unborn, like we're selling, we're at least, I bet you at a minimum, we're activating the same parts of the brain that happen when we watch a commercial. Maybe I'm just a hypothesis, but I would imagine there are similar things happening in the mind, similar networks being, lit up.
Yeah, I could definitely see that being the case. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting though. It makes me think, like, is that a little bit necessary? I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm just thinking, like, of the potential necessity to recognize that there may be a way of seeing things that is not familiar to us yet. You know what I mean? But like it could be a necessity to have that part of our brains activated on a certain level when we first start relating to all of this. But again, maybe it comes back to like what we were saying earlier, like it's a process of multiple things functioning at once. You know what I mean? Because like there definitely is. There's the sentiment in the Dharma teachings as well that runs along the lines of like, fundamentally you have everything you need, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, even if we just as simple of an example as Buddha nature kind of works for that. So it also maybe is this. I mean, especially at this point in history, like there's the message of the Dharma or Buddhism, if we call it that, is there's so many things operating at once.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. No, I get your point. Yeah. I mean, it could be, I mean, we do need to motivate. There is an aspect of this that is we need to motivate towards something that's unfamiliar. So, yeah.
Right. Because like we do have to do something, but it's subtle. It's not so much do, right? Like we were saying.
I'll jump into, do you have anything else for part 6? I was going to jump to part 7.
Yeah, that's good with me.
Okay. So part 7 is an examination of the unconditioned. And I think we're kind of looking at a comparison between unconditioned and uncompounded. And Batchelor's idea is that the Buddha here is looking for a dynamic way of describing the composition of something rather than like a static description. And in fact, the way the Buddha describes the unconditioned, he says, "Bhikkhus, I will teach you the unconditioned in the path leading to the unconditioned. Listen to this. And what, bhikkhus, is the unconditioned? An ending of desire, an ending of hatred, an ending of delusion. This is the unconditioned. And what, bhikkhus, is the path leading to the unconditioned? Mindfulness directed to the body. That is called the path leading to the unconditioned." So Gautama basically said that the unconditioned is an ending of the 3 inclinations: desire, hatred, and delusion. And he suggests that through mindfulness of body, we can experience a frame of mind that does not incline towards the effluences of anger, desire, and delusion. So here we kind of resolve this idea of the unborn and the unmade with this new way of describing it as the unconditioned. So the unconditioned here is this liberation from the effluences. And the best way to do that is really by connecting with our experience, what was earlier described as the all, what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we feel, what we think, this is described as the all. And in fact, he describes that as becoming aware of that as being how we bring about the unconditioned.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me too. Like maybe the only way to understand what is unconditioned is through understanding what is conditioned, Yeah.
One of the things I highlighted here was this paragraph that says, Gautama takes a noun, the unconditioned, and treats it as a verb, not to be conditioned by something. He seems acutely aware of the relational nature of language. There is no such thing, for example, as freedom per se. There is only freedom from constraints, or freedom to act in ways that were not possible because of those constraints. Nor is there any awakening per se, but only awakening from the sleep of delusion, or awakening to the presence of others who suffer. And there is no such thing as the unconditioned, only the possibility of not being conditioned by something. Nirvana, therefore, does not refer to the attainment of a transcendent absolute state apart from the conditions of life, but to the possibility of living here and now, emancipated from the inclinations of desire, hatred, and delusion. A life not conditioned by these instincts and drives would be an enriched one. No longer would one be the victim of paralyzing habits. One would be freed to respond to circumstances in fresh, unimpeded ways. Amen.
Yeah. I can't say that I have anything to add more than that.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, he said it so well. He points out the Sanskrit term for the ending of the effluences the Sanskrit terms for the ending of the effluences are also used to define nirvana, the deathless, comprehension, and the unconditioned. And he poses the question, how is the unconditioned synonymous with comprehension? Which is, of course, is the first of our 4 tasks. And he gives a response from the Buddha to answer that question. And the Buddha said, Bhikkhus, I will teach you what is to be comprehended in comprehension. Listen to this. And what is to be comprehended? Form, feeling, perception, inclinations, and consciousness. These are what are to be comprehended. And what is comprehension? An ending of desire, an ending of hatred, an ending of delusion. This is comprehension. So the same as the uncompounded. Another quote here related to that, he says, what is to be comprehended is not the unconditioned, but this conditioned world itself, which I think is basically an echo of what you said just a minute ago. Well, I have to be honest, I didn't take any notes on part 8, part 9, just a little bit. Do you have anything for part 8 you want to share?
No, I mean, not really. I do. In part 9, I did like that, like the translation or interpretation of Tathagata that he puts in, which is one who is just so.
Yeah.
Like, I don't quite get how he got there, because I guess kind of talking about the original interpretation of the word Tathagata, which is normally translated something like one who has gone to suchness, or thus gone one. So in that word, the gata means gone. But then later he says that this guy, Richard Gombrich, points out that these readings over-determine the function of gata, or gone, which here simply means is. That was the thing that I didn't quite get. How does gone in this case actually just mean is? Because it's like almost the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Like either way, I do like where they got one who is just so. Although I don't see that as being way different than one who has gone to suchness either.
Yeah. It's like a little less woo-woo, I think.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
But I love the idea.
But yeah,
here.
that's all
I like that too, because the note I'd written is that Tathagata is one who does not dissemble or pretend. And that reminds me too of like one of my favorite quotes. Yeah, he said, the use of the term almost exclusively in reference to the Buddha or a Buddha implies that not dissembling is one of his defining features. Since he does as he speaks and speaks as he does, says the text, therefore he is called the Tathagata. And so, yeah, I like that idea of like, because that reminds me of the quote from Crazy Wisdom that always comes to mind for me, which is the hardest discipline is being who you are. And I think that very much aligns with this teaching on this word that we call the Buddha. You know, he is truly himself, you know, and
right. Yeah.
And I think part of the reason he can do that is because he's not laying his shit on other people like we talked about earlier. You know, he is seeing a situation as it is, accepting it. Same thing with people, you know, and then he's able to be truly himself. I think a lot of times the not being truly ourselves is an active process of trying to shift the external reality to something else, you know? So we try to act like we have higher status, or act like we're, you know, in a hurry. You know, there's like all these different things that I think affect the way we act that probably all relate back to some sort of projection and some sort of lack of wisdom or compassion ultimately.
Yeah. and kind of like lack just a basic trust in the fundamental like wholeness or okayness of reality. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
why do we feel like we have to like con the situation? It's kind of
Yeah.
odd.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Well, that's all I got for this one. I love this chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That was good. I like that.
Yeah. Listeners may not realize, but we did this episode in 2 parts, but we started about 3 hours ago. Again, we keep doing these like long sessions, and they don't even particularly feel long. Maybe the last 15 minutes or so, my voice starts to get tired. But
yeah, but I mean, yeah, it didn't feel like that long to me.
Yeah, it's good practice, man. Thanks for doing it with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Any plugs you want to put in? Catfish? Cathead?
I don't think so. Catfish. Yeah. Everybody come on down and watch us play at the Cathead Distillery on Saturday.
Nice. Actually, this won't be out for another 3 weeks.
All right, never mind.
Forget it. All right. Well, yeah, go ahead.
I don't think I have anything. I feel good about it. I'm off to go see Krungbin play 2 shows in New Orleans, which I'm excited about now.
Nice. Yeah, that'll be awesome. This is not your first time seeing them, right?
It is?
Oh, awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
Good. Taking your mom too.
I've been looking forward to it for a while. Yep. Mom's going one night and girlfriend is going second night.
That's awesome.
So,
wow. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, we'll be back next week for the next chapter, which is what is the next chapter? Sunakata, the traitor.
Oof. Okay.
All right. Well, we appreciate y'all. See you next time. Take care.
Bye.